Hi, everybody. Welcome back to PCS 101, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 23rd. And what I have scheduled for today is our talking about organizing and outlining, introductions and conclusions, and ultimately language, again, so that we could prepare for our upcoming speeches. So you could see that organizing and outlining, the advantages are multiple. You can test ideas. It's easier to remember. It's easier to present. In fact, that was something that many of you talked about in terms of ways to reduce anxiety and nervousness was just to be well prepared. Having an outline is one of the ways to go about doing that. It makes you more credible because you've put more thought and effort into organizing your arguments, and that also makes you more persuasive. And it lowers your frustration. Now, you might be familiar with the outlines that are very common for English papers, and in those cases, usually the outlines are quite detailed. The more detailed, the better. It is the exact opposite with public speaking. You want just key words and phrases. So, in the event, if you were to lose focus, you could look down quickly and find your place and then look back up and continue. And you do need an outline for presenting all of your speeches. And I'm asking that you submit in that outline to me on the day that you also post your speech, and that you submit that outline via PDF, which is how my grading program works best, to my email, which is ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. There are lots of different ways to put together an outline, and the textbook talks about some of them. And if you wanted an example of how I put together an outline, you can just look beneath this video and you can see that what I do is I identify main topics and then subtopics within those topics. And of course, with your outline, part of what you need to think about is what your thesis is, what your central idea. And then you need to think about your organizational plan. There's lots of different ways that you could organize arguments. This is where your experiences with writing perhaps English papers can be very useful. We do know, as we saw with the Toastmasters video, that everything has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. But outside of that, how you organize your arguments in part will be dependent on the topic, and in part will be dependent on the audience, and in part will be dependent on your comfort level. But some of these might sound familiar to you in relation to how perhaps you've put together arguments in the past for papers. Chronological argument, talking about time. First this, then that, then that. This is a wonderful way to organize a speech or any kind of argument about how to do something, how to teach somebody something, which is what you will be doing with your second speech. You can organize things topically based on categories, which is what I do below on my notes. You can put things in order of importance. You could go both ways, put the most important first so that you impress your audience, though you do risk losing their interest and attention as the lesser arguments are discussed. Or the other way around is that you can start with the lesser arguments and work your way to the most important. Again, you have to risk perhaps not being able to keep your audience's attention until you get to the ending. Spatial or location is a wonderful way to organize an argument, especially if you're trying to describe what something looks like. And I oftentimes use the example of a real estate agent who might be trying to sell a piece of property, and all of the different ways this real estate agent might approach that. They might talk about the property in terms of time, especially if it's new construction or if it's very old construction and it's historical. They might want to talk about it in terms of topics. So there's 4 or 5 major elements about that home that the real estate agent wants to emphasize. However, they might not just use topics, but put them in order of importance. And order of importance sometimes is subjective. So, one couple viewing the home, the most important thing might be the neighborhood and the school district. Another couple looking at the home, what might be more important is the new roof. So, it will depend on audience. Or we could describe this property spatially, that once you walk in, immediately to the right is a living room, and then immediately to the left is a basement door, and you go up a staircase right in front of you to get to the kitchen. You've never been in this property, but I'm beginning to explain to you some of the ways that it appears so you can begin to visualize. You can even organize things based on relationships, though cause and effect sometimes is not necessarily that clear cut. Some suggestions: audiences tend to respond well to that which is familiar. So you might want to utilize some familiar arguments or some familiar pieces of information. This is another teacher technique, is that we usually build upon older information. Inquiry: ask questions, and hopefully you supply the answers, or the answers are self-evident by the time you get to the ending of your speech. A rhetorical question basically is a question that doesn't necessarily expect an answer. The answer is sort of implied or assumed. Problem and solution works very nicely for something like a persuasive speech. Process of elimination. So you talk about all of the options, and then you're left with the correct option. So the detailed outline that you would do in an English class or perhaps in other classes is very different from the speaking outline. Again, where you would use keywords and phrases. You might want to bold or underline important points. Try to indicate transitions, even sometimes list stage directions. I've had students do things like listing breathing in their outline, and that was another technique that many of you had talked about in terms of reducing nerves or anxiety. I always suggest that you use a hard copy for your outline, notes, whether it be paper or note cards or some combination thereof, rather than rely on something that's electronic, because then if there is electronic failure, then you've lost your notes. So I practice what I preach. So these are the notes that I'm working off of today that are basically at the bottom of this video. And one of the reasons why it's so helpful to have a outline is because people have notoriously poor memories. That's something to keep in mind when you're putting together your speech and thinking about your audience as well, because you probably will repeat yourself more frequently than you would in a paper when somebody can go back and reread what was written. Studies have suggested that most people can remember approximately plus or minus 7 items. Some have even suggested it's as few as plus or minus 3, which is pretty problematic because minus 3 is 2 or 1. Now, obviously, we remember a lot more information than that because we use all kinds of memory techniques, such as chunking, grouping like items together. We'll oftentimes do that with phone numbers, where you've got the first 3 numerals, and then you've got 4 numerals that follow. So basically, you've got 2 pieces of information to remember rather than separate numbers. Mnemonics are memory devices that I would suspect you've probably utilized yourself in your academic career to try to remember things, whether it's through repetition. Repetition is one of the best ways to remember something. Acronyms. So what you've got is a word, and in that word, each letter of that word represents the first letter of something that you are trying to remember. It oftentimes is utilized in things like mathematics and the sciences, though I can think of an acronym that applies very well to writing, which is KISS. And in the word KISS, each of those letters represent a word. Keep it simple, silly, or keep it simple, stupid. You might have heard of it that way. That's what basically the acronym KISS is for. Alliteration. So if you think about how oftentimes we remember things like songs because they utilize things like rhyme or alliteration. These are all memory techniques. Alliteration is the repetition of initial consonant sounds, while rhyme is the repetition of the ending consonant sounds. I wanted to talk a little bit about the introduction and conclusion in particular. Now, all of the parts of a speech are important, but especially the introduction and conclusion because of something called the primary recency effect, that people best remember what they hear or see first and what they hear or see last. You might want to test this, let's say, with something like a vacation that you may have taken in the past. Chances are you remember the beginning and the ending better than you remember any of the other pieces. But what this means is that you want to put particular attention into your introduction and conclusion, even though they probably aren't as long as your body. Lots of different ways that you can introduce and conclude a speech. And once again, the techniques that you've utilized for writing can be very useful in this respect. People tend to respond very well when you're talking about something that's real, that's happening now, something that has proximity, something that's nearby, something that is familiar. So, my own example that as I scan the news in the morning, I'm more likely to pay attention to something related to college teaching because that is real and it's familiar and it's perhaps even close proximity if it's about college teaching at Greenfield Community College. So that would ultimately get my attention. Yet people also like novelty and suspense. And that's something that you can oftentimes see in the media where they will use conflict and suspense and novelty to try to gain interest. Humor is another way to begin or end a paper. Just even stating something is vital or important is another way to begin or end a paper or to begin or end a speech. And for students who feel a little bit more comfortable writing papers, you may want to actually write out your speech as a paper and then reduce it to key words and phrases. That would be your speaking outline. I actually give the same advice to my English classes, that for English class students who feel a little bit more comfortable speaking rather than writing, I suggest that they record their speech as they speak it and then transcribe it. And what they should have is basically the working outline for what it is that they would be doing for a final polished paper. Questions and answers. Again, the idea is if you're raising a question, you will provide the answer. The answer will be self-evident. Quotation can be very useful as well. Yeah, lots of resources that you can utilize. One of my favorites is Bartlett's Familiar Quotations. You might have heard of it before. Very well known. It's organized much like a Webster's Dictionary. And I expect you've probably heard of a Webster's Dictionary. Bartlett's Familiar Quotations is organized by category in alphabetical order. So you were to look up a word, something like war, and then what you would find are multiple quotations that would be based on war, and then you would choose what's appropriate. I know everybody runs now to the internet. Be careful, because of course it is the wild, wild west when it comes to the internet. Just because a quote has been attributed to somebody, that may not necessarily be the case. So you do want to verify. And I do remember once listening to a speech where a student began with a quote, and it was a rather lengthy quote. And the student was reading the quote because, of course, you want accuracy when you are quoting something. But we had all assumed, I and the audience, that the student was going to read their speech, which is not what you want to do. You want to maintain eye contact and have a sense of conversationality with your audience. Once the student was done with the quote, then they shifted their performance. But I had suggested to that student that they might want to begin by saying, let me begin with a quote, so that ultimately we would know that this would not be for the entirety of the speech. Storytelling and illustration. People love stories. They do have to be related, however, to what it is you're talking about. Making a personal reference is oftentimes something you can do. A startling statement is something that you can do. And I believe I shared with you in our previous class about how I had a colleague who was teaching public speaking at another institution. The student was talking about being true to oneself and began to disrobe, in other words, wanting to show their true selves. And obviously, they were trying to startle the audience, but that was quite ineffective. So you need to be careful, and you need to question whether or not it's appropriate when you're trying to startle an audience. But I do remember a speech that I heard from a student, and it was in a face-to-face class, and we were on break, so nobody was really paying much attention when somebody in the back of the room began to choke. And then another student ran up to the choking victim, performed the Heimlich maneuver, out popped a rolled ball of paper. And as we're all staring at this paper, the person who had, quote, performed, unquote, the Heimlich maneuver walked to the front of the class and announced that their speech was about the Heimlich maneuver. What we had just witnessed was a simulation, but if it had been real, would we know what to do? So basically, they were scheduled to deliver their speech after the break. And it truly was brilliant. This was a friend of the students who was pretending to choke. And yes, things could have gone wrong. The student might have choked for real, or perhaps somebody would have gotten to this supposed victim before the speaker and actually perform the Heimlich, and you could actually hurt somebody when performing the Heimlich. So none of that happened. It was all well planned, but I do always remember that speech when I think about doing something startling to your audience. Forecasting and summarizing. A lot of times writing a paper, giving a speech is telling us what you're going to discuss, discussing it, and then reminding us what you discussed. Even issuing a challenge, especially if you wanted us to take a particular kind of action, that for especially something like a persuasive speech. If you're using the most recent edition of the text, I believe on page 129, there's a graphic that talks a little bit about how you could get your audience's attention. And the third piece that I wanted to talk about was language. And this is one of the ways that public speaking probably deviates from writing, because writing is very precise. You can do multiple drafts and you can get it to be as perfect as possible. That's not going to necessarily happen with public speaking, because ultimately you have to deliver within the moment. Obviously, you want to be well rehearsed, but you also don't want to memorize your speech, as the Toastmasters video talked about, because then it'll sound pretty stiff and stilted. So what you want to do is just have keywords and phrases and then fill that in with unscripted material. You want to have the oral style in delivering a speech, which means that it's conversational. And that usually means that you're using simpler vocabulary and shorter sentences, and it's less formal. You do want to be accurate, you do want to be simple, and you do want to restate things and speech. And that said, there are lots of different ways that you can play with language. For instance, with definitions, we usually think of the dictionary definition of something. That's called the denotation. But consider also the connotations of a word, the associations of it. Cheap and frugal both mean the same thing in some respects. Not spending a lot of money. And yet, cheap sounds negative and frugal sounds positive. So there are different associations behind those. And actually, you can give a negative definition, defining what a word is not, rather than defining what a word is. So I might say by happiness, I don't necessarily mean wealth, but I mean health, and I mean contentment. So ultimately, I'm creating my own definition. A contextual definition is determined by situation. So think about the word brief, which in an English class would mean concise, but a brief could also be a legal document. A brief could also be an article of clothing. So depending on whether or not you're in the courtroom or you're in the fashion industry or you are in an English class, the word brief could mean very different things. You can define something based on its etymology, the historical derivation of the word. That's one of the ways that using dictionaries can be so useful, because you can look up this kind of information. Exemplar definition, where you're using an example. And analog definition, where you're comparing two different things. So something as simple as a definition, you can basically create on your own. And thinking about advanced techniques, and many speech rankings and ratings have ranked Martin Luther King's speech, "I Have a Dream," as perhaps the best speech ever given. Again, obviously this is subjective, but if you think about speeches that are considered to be exemplary, then usually they're using advanced techniques such as imagery. They're trying to utilize senses, taste and sight and scent and touch, to assist the audience with visualization. They will oftentimes use metaphors. It's a literary technique where you are comparing two dissimilar things, and you are not using like or as. If you are using like or as, that is a simile, when you compare two dissimilar things and use like or as. And I had talked about rhyme, where the endings of the word sound similar, and alliteration, where the word beginning sounds similar. And again, you shouldn't necessarily hold yourself to this level of expectation as you're beginning your public speaking skills, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. Do think about being audience-centered, which means being appropriate to the audience and adapting to the needs of the audience. And whenever possible, try to use neutral terms. Try to be culturally sensitive and inclusive whenever possible. So, what are we going to talk about in our next class? Delivery and practice. And in our next class, that happens to be chapter 11 in the newest edition of the textbook. And in our next class, we're going to have our first quiz. And the quiz will be 20 questions, multiple choice, true, false, short answer, open book, open notes, so you can utilize the resources from this class. And hopefully these will be questions that not only show that you've been watching the videos and doing the reading, but that these are questions of things that you should consider when you are putting together your first speech. Because what's happening after that is the delivery for the first speech. What I'll do next class as well is I'll talk a little bit about some of the technical aspects of uploading a video of yourself for your speech. But what I wanted to do today, so I want to make sure that there's time for you to do that, is to have you watch 3 sample autobiographical student speeches. So this is in the 4th section below. And these are all speeches that were posted on YouTube by students like yourself, in no way connected with GCC, so you don't have to worry that one day that you would be used as a test speech. And these may give you some ideas of how to proceed with your autobiographical speech. Obviously, these students were not presenting to satisfy the requirements for this class, so we can't necessarily judge the speech based on, let's say, its length, but we can certainly judge things like introductions and bodies and conclusions. So these are 3 very different kinds of speeches, and what I am going to ask you for your attendance question is to please list 1 strength and 1 weakness from each of the 3 sample autobiographical speeches. So just a word or 2 or 3 would suffice. You don't have to write a lot of content. And that would be due by Saturday the 25th. Certainly, if you need additional time, ask me for an extension, and I'll be happy to grant it to you. As you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you certainly are encouraged to. And as you can see, I'm responding to all of you. So I'll leave you with watching these 3 sample autobiographical speeches, and leaving you to identify 1 strength and 1 weakness from each of the 3 that you've watched. And then next class, we will talk about delivery and practice and quiz number 1. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next week, where we finally get to present our first speech. 5 minutes autobiographical. Take care. Bye-bye.